Looking at this data, it just doesn't seem likely. Why are they leaving out data? If I'm reviewing a paper, my bullshit alarm immediately starts going off. It's probably a longer discussion, but probably one that the community needs to have about whether it's really ethical for companies to put out press releases that are designed to get consumers to buy a product based solely on research that has not yet undergone any sort of quality control or peer review process. And that's certainly what happened in this case. That is simply not acceptable in the scientific literature. My name is Matt Kaberlein, and welcome to the Optispan YouTube channel. Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan Podcast. In this episode of Longevity This Week, I'm going to talk about a clinical trial in dogs of a supplement that has been claimed to, quote, reverse aging. So this is actually part two. In part one of this episode, I discussed the supplement, which is called Leap Years, being marketed by the company animal bioRxiv. And that was based on a press release released on February 29th, where, again, they claimed that this supplement reversed aging in dogs. And that claim was based on a preprint that was submitted by Dr. Natasha Olby at North Carolina State to the preprint server bioRxiv. So in this video, I'm going to do a deeper dive into that preprint and explain what was shown, what wasn't shown, and why I do not believe that the data there support the idea that this supplement really has any beneficial effects in dogs. Before I do that, though, before I really get into the weeds of the preprint, I do want to say that Dr. Olby has a very good reputation among the veterinary community. And in fact, many of my colleagues on the Dog Aging Project highly respect her. I'm going to be pretty critical of this study, but I want to make it clear that I'm not suggesting any unethical behavior by Dr. Olby or her team. I think, unfortunately, the way the press release was timed and presented, this certainly created the appearance of coordination. And I think this is perhaps an example of why scientists really need to be careful in these kinds of situations, and in particular, who they choose to work with in the for-profit space on these kinds of studies. I also think it's probably worth taking a second to describe what a preprint is. So a preprint is really a preliminary version of a scientific manuscript that hasn't been vetted in any way. Authors can say pretty much anything they want to. They can upload it to this preprint server without any peer review or any quality control. And so in this case, the preprint server was bioRxiv. But again, it's really just important to appreciate this is really putting out there the interpretation that the authors want you to see and really only showing the data that they want you to see. And so I think it's probably a longer discussion, but probably one that the community needs to have about whether it's really ethical for companies to put out press releases that are designed to get consumers to buy a product based solely on research that has not yet undergone any sort of quality control or peer review process. And that's certainly what happened in this case. So again, just worth appreciating the difference between preprint server and publication in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. So I'm kind of concerned that we're going to see these preprint servers more and more often used as almost advertising space for companies rather than the opportunity for the scientific community and scientific discourse they are meant to be. So we'll kind of keep an eye on this and see if this becomes a pattern going forward. Okay, so in any case, let's dive into the animal bioscience preprint. And the title of this preprint is a randomized controlled clinical trial demonstrates improved cognitive function in senior dogs supplemented with a senolytic and an NAD precursor. And so you guys are going to hear me say this over and over again. The first thing I always do when I'm either reading a scientific paper in the published literature or reviewing a paper is I'll take a look at the title and the abstract, and I'll ask myself, did the authors actually show what they claim in the title and the abstract? So let's drill down a little bit just on the title. And it's useful to kind of think about, okay, what are they claiming? And in order to demonstrate that, what will they have to show me in the paper? So again, a randomized controlled clinical trial, okay, they have to do a randomized controlled clinical trial, demonstrates improved cognitive function. So this is important. What do they have to show to demonstrate improved cognitive function? And In a clinical trial, in my view, what you would need to show is, number one, you have to have a validated measure of cognitive function. You can't just make up how we're going to measure cognitive function. And number two, you have to show statistical significance using rigorous statistical approaches. So that's minimally the two things that would need to be shown to demonstrate improved cognitive function. In senior dogs supplemented with a senolytic and NAD precursor combination. So they're claiming that the treatment here is a combination of an NAD precursor and a senolytic. So they would have to show that it is in fact an NAD precursor and a senolytic, and that they achieve higher NAD levels, because that's the goal of giving an NAD booster, higher NAD levels and senolytic activity in the dogs, in my view. You could argue that if they get a successful outcome in the clinical trial, maybe they don't need to show that they're actually achieving the target activity that they claim they have, although I think from a scientific perspective, in terms of mechanism, certainly if this was an FDA clinical trial, you would need to show that you actually know the mechanism as well. So I'm going to put that in the necessary bucket that I would want to see if I was reviewing this preprint. Okay, so now let's go to the abstract. And the abstract is pretty long, so we'll break it up into bite-sized pieces. So the first sentence of the abstract is age-related decline in mobility and cognition are associated with cellular senescence and NAD depletion in dogs and people. Okay, so I don't think this is actually true. If you watched part one, I kind of touched on this. There's certainly a little bit of evidence for declines in NAD in some tissues in people, better evidence in mice, but this is pretty limited and not particularly reproducible. And as I mentioned in part one of this video, there was a comprehensive review published in 2022 that basically said there's almost no evidence in people that NAD levels decline with age. And so that's even less convincing in dogs. In fact, as far as I know, there is absolutely no data in dogs showing that NAD levels decline with age. Cellular senescence in humans is better established, but even still, it's been pretty limited to, immune cells and a few other cells and tissues. And while I believe the same thing is probably going to be true in dogs, again, I don't think this has actually been established or shown in the scientific literature. So I would say in general, when authors make questionable claims in the very first sentence of the abstract, if I'm reviewing a paper, my bullshit alarm immediately starts going off. And so this is just a piece of advice to any grad students or postdocs out there. It's generally a really bad idea to say things that aren't rock solid true in the abstract of your paper. So then the next sentence in the abstract is a combination of a novel NAD precursor and senolytic, and the name of this mixture is LY-D6-2. I'm 99% positive that's leap years that the company is selling. So I'm just going to call it leap years from here on out. LY, I assume that's what leap years, that stands for leap years, was examined in this randomized controlled trial. Okay, so let me read that sentence again. A combination of a novel NAD precursor and senolytic, LY-D6-2, leap years, was examined in this randomized controlled trial. So again, they're claiming that their supplement has two molecules, an NAD precursor and a senolytic. And it's worth noting, and I'm just going to say this because there's no data in the paper to actually show you. They never actually show in the preprint what these molecules are. As far as at least I couldn't find it. I could not find the name of the molecules that are in LY-D6-2. So there is in fact no way to evaluate whether it is an NAD precursor and a senolytic. And so from my perspective, I've never seen that before, and that is simply not acceptable in the scientific literature. If you are doing a clinical trial and you want to publish that clinical trial, you have to tell people what you actually tested. So this, to me, was just really weird. And again, is raising some pretty significant red flags in my mind before we even get into the meat of the data. So very strange. Okay, so third sentence of the abstract, 70 dogs were enrolled and allocated into placebo, low dose, or full dose groups. Primary outcomes were change in cognitive impairment measured with the owner-reported Canine Cognitive Dysfunction Rating, CCDR scale, and change in activity measured with physical activity monitors. Okay, so there's a few things there. 70 dogs, 3 arms to this clinical trial. So 2 dose groups, low dose, high dose, and placebo. So that's reasonably good size. I mean, it's not huge, but for a kind of phase 1 safety trial, that's a reasonably good sized clinical trial. Presumably they did power calculations and determined that this was enough animals. It seems a little small to me for a clinical trial to actually show efficacy, but in any case, it's reasonably good size, especially for a veterinary clinical trial. So the primary endpoints here, there are 2 of them. Cognitive impairment, and that's measured with this CCDR scale. So I'll get more into what that is, but it's a survey-based instrument that the owners complete that is thought to be diagnostic for dementia in dogs, and we'll come back to that. So that's one primary endpoint. The other primary endpoint was activity, and they were using activity monitors. So kind of like, you can think of it like a Fitbit for dogs. Okay, so they've defined the primary endpoints, and then in the next sentence, they say 59 dogs completed evaluations at the 3-month primary endpoint, and 51 reached the 6-month secondary endpoint. Okay, so this is a little weird again. So they just got done telling us what the primary endpoints were. That was cognitive function as measured by CCDR and activity as measured by activity monitors. And now they are adding a further criteria and saying that 3 months in this 6-month trial is the endpoint that they're going to consider for statistical evaluation of the outcomes. So that's maybe not completely unheard of, but it's a little weird to do a 6-month trial and decide that the halfway point is going to be your endpoint for the trial. Again, not what you would typically expect to see. Typically, you would expect to see either you look at all the measured time points in the trial, or the last time point in the trial is what you would use for your primary endpoint determination. So they do say that 6 months will be a secondary endpoint. Again, that's a little odd, but that's what they're saying here. So we'll give them the benefit of the doubt on this. I will say these details should have all been spelled out in the clinical trial protocol prior to starting the trial. So it'd be nice at some point to see that clinical trial protocol. So then the next sentence of the abstract reads, there was a significant difference in CCDR score across treatment groups from baseline to the primary endpoint, with the largest decrease in the full dose group. Okay, we have to parse this a bit because it's written in a very specific way. So they're claiming that there is a statistically significant difference with a p-value of 0.02. So typically 0.05 would be the cutoff. So this is below that. That shows statistical significance. In the primary endpoint, the CCDR score, okay? So that's this owner-reported survey for cognitive function, and this will be important when we come back to it. The language here is interesting. So they say this is across groups, not between groups. And this is the only positive result in the entire preprint. So the entire study hinges on this result. So we're going to take a very close look and see what was actually done here and whether or not it was really a statistically significant result. And again, they are specifically noting at 3 months, right? So they aren't saying in the abstract what happened at 1 month or 6 months, which, as you'll see, I think will turn out to be important in how we interpret this. They then go on to say there were no significant differences between groups in changes in measured activity. So none of the other endpoints, the primary endpoint of activity or other exploratory endpoints that they considered, showed any statistically significant difference between groups. And so this is really all you need to know. If people fail to get a significant result in a clinical trial, they will often try to sell you on trends or things going in the right direction. And that's okay. Like, I get it. It's worth noting sometimes that the directionality was there, but we didn't get statistical significance. Nonetheless, you have to recognize that it's really just a sales job. The clinical trial did not show any significant evidence for an improvement in any of the other endpoints, period. Okay, that's just important to recognize. So now the abstract goes on. and this is the sales job. However, the proportion of dogs that improved in frailty and owner-reported activity levels and happiness was higher in the full dose group than other groups. Okay, so they're trying to sell you that there was something there when in fact the statistics don't show that there's anything there. Adverse events occurred equally across groups. That's good. This suggests that the supplement at least did not do harm, at least over the time frame of the clinical trial. This is interesting. All groups showed improvement in cognition, frailty, and activity, suggesting placebo effect and benefits of trial participation. This is seen sometimes. Placebo effect is real. Maybe the dogs were having more interaction with their owners because the owners knew this was part of a clinical trial. It's hard to say why that happened here, but it does make it hard sometimes to carefully interpret the results of clinical trials when you see a placebo effect in the placebo group. Okay, so then the abstract finishes with, we conclude that LY-D62 significantly improves owner-assessed cognitive function and may have broader effects on frailty, activity, and happiness as reported by the owners. So again, on first read to me, especially after I've sort of talked about some of the red flags that came up, this really felt like the authors are trying hard to present the results as much better than they actually are. So let's take a look and see. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is come back to the one possible claim for a benefit from the supplement here. And so to do that, we have to start by understanding what is the CCDR score. CCDR is a survey instrument designed to assess cognitive function in dogs. So in the Dog Aging Project, we use a similar tool. We call it the Canine Social and Learned Behavior Survey. And this is a survey with a small number of questions. It only takes maybe 10 minutes to complete, where the owners are asked about their dog's behavior. And based on their answers to those questions, a total score is obtained. And this was first published in a paper from Salvin and colleagues, where it was validated to diagnose dementia in dogs. And so really the only thing you need to know here is two things. One is a higher score is suggestive of reduced cognitive function. So higher in this case means worse cognitive function. And the survey has been clinically validated as a binary tool. And what I mean by that is that if the score is above 50, that is diagnostic for dementia. Canine cognitive dysfunction is what the disorder is called in dogs. If it's less than 50, there's no diagnosis of dementia. And so as I mentioned, there's the assumption that it can be used continuously. In other words, what I mean by that is that a score of 48 would mean worse cognitive function than a score of 40 would mean worse cognitive function than a score of 30, but it hasn't actually been validated for use as a clinical tool. As far as I know, maybe I'm wrong. As far as I know, it has not been validated for use as a continuous tool. It's used as a binary tool, above 50 dementia, below 50 no dementia. So that's important because here the authors are really trying to claim that they can use it as a continuous tool in dogs who do not have dementia, and look at the score, and if you get a statistically significant difference in score between groups, even though all of the groups and presumably all of the dogs will be below the diagnostic threshold for dementia, that still is indicative of a difference in cognitive function. So I believe that's probably true. But because this hasn't been validated, what we really don't know is sensitivity. In other words, would a difference from 37 to 35 really mean anything? Would a difference from 45 to 35 really mean anything? I don't know the answer to that because this tool has never actually been used or validated in that way before. So we have to be really careful here, I think, in the use of a tool in a different way than what it is validated to be used for. And that's what the authors have done here. Again, as far as I know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they can provide reports where it has been validated as a continuous tool. Okay, so let's just lay that potential flaw aside for a minute and take a look at their claim of statistical significance here. So the first thing I try to do immediately is just look at the figures and evaluate the primary claim. So in this case, they are claiming that at the endpoint of 3 months, there was a statistically significant difference between groups although they say across groups. And again, I think that's probably important, that wording. But what they're really trying to claim is that the high dose group is significantly better, has significantly better cognitive function than the placebo at the 3-month time point. That's really what they're trying to claim. And so that's in figure 2. And so that's shown here. And what you can see is, again, anybody who really has looked at much data will immediately look at these curves and I think come to the conclusion there's probably nothing here. So the curves are crossing. There's no dose response. In other words, the low dose group isn't between the placebo and the high dose group. The high dose group, or what they call full dose group, actually has worse CCDR score at 1 month and then a little bit better at 3 months. It really doesn't look real. The low dose group is actually above, meaning worse cognitive function if we accept that this tool can be used this way at all 3 time points. So again, just looking at this data, I think a generous interpretation is this is not convincing at all. And I would probably conclude, if this was data that was coming out of my lab, that there's just nothing here. Okay, so I think one of the things that's kind of frustrating here is that they don't show error bars. And again, if I was a reviewer, that to me is a red flag. There's probably a reason why they don't show their error bars. They also don't show the 6-month time point, which in the abstract they mention as a secondary endpoint. Again, if I was a reviewer, when I see something like that, I immediately wonder, why are they leaving out data? Oftentimes, when people leave out data, it's because the data didn't fit what they're trying to sell you or the model that they want to believe. So we're going to have to look at the 6-month data as well to kind of try to figure out, why was that not included in this figure? So no error bars, no 6-month data, and just looking at the curves, they don't really seem to be different from each other. And yet, they're claiming a statistically significant difference at the month 3 time point. Okay, let's first look at the data with the error bars and with the 6-month time point. And I do want to give the authors credit. So they did include all of the raw data in the supplemental material. So it is possible, takes a lot of work, but it is possible to dive into the supplemental data and plot out the curves with the error bars. And so that's what's shown here. And again, I think if you have any sort of background in data, you're going to look at these with the size of the error bars and immediately conclude, again, there's nothing here. These curves are right on top of each other. I should say, I didn't get exactly the same numbers that the authors got in their table in the main figures. I'm not sure why that is. I did notice in the supplemental figures that there were many dogs who did not complete the trial. Maybe those were included in the author's analysis. I took the dogs out that did not complete the trial. So that might have changed things a little bit, but it really didn't change it much. Certainly not enough to really change the outcome of the analyses. So then the question that I start asking is, how did they possibly get a statistically significant improvement from the treatment at 3 months? Again, looking at this data, it just doesn't seem likely. So if you look at the claim in the abstract and in the main text, they say there was a significant difference between treatment groups over the 3-month period, with the full dose group showing the largest decrease, and remember, lower score means an improvement or better cognitive function, showing the largest decrease in CCDR score. So again, significant difference between treatment groups, with the full dose group showing the largest decrease in CCDR score. They don't actually say exactly what they did for this statistical analysis, which is a little bit frustrating. In the methods, they say changes in CCDR score, cognitive testing performance, and off-leash gait speed over the study were compared between groups with repeated measures ANOVA. So they say what the test is, but they didn't actually say exactly how they used that test to get the statistical significance. So I'm going to make an assumption, because I could not get the P0.02 that they got, that what they're really comparing here are all 3 groups. And what this test is telling them is that there are differences between the 3 groups. And the second thing that they're doing, I'm assuming, is looking at the change over time, not the absolute values. And that would be the right thing to do, right? If you're doing a trial and you expect that your intervention is going to lead to a bigger or smaller change in whatever you're measuring, you should be comparing the change over time, not the absolute measurement, especially when the groups start at different levels, like was the case with the low-dose placebo groups. I'm going to assume that's what they did. And my concern here is that if they did, in fact, see a statistically significant difference among all three groups, that difference is probably driven by the low-dose group and really doesn't support the claim that there's a statistically significant difference between the high-dose group and the placebo. And remember, the low-dose group actually performed worse than the high-dose group. So really the thing we're interested in and what they are trying to convince you of is that the high-dose supplement led to an improvement in cognitive function versus the placebo. So I think if that's what you're trying to claim, what you really need to do is a direct comparison between those two groups. So again, unclear what they really did, but I'm not sure they actually did the comparison that would justify the claim that they're trying to make. Okay, so if we look at the actual numbers here, this is showing the table in the preprint and the table that I calculated from the raw data. Again, they didn't say exactly what they did, but I removed dogs that did not complete the study. So if there was a missing data point at any of the time points, that dog came out of the study. So you can see my numbers are very close to theirs. I don't think that there's any reason to think that this would change any of the downstream analyses enough to make a difference. So one thing we can ask is if we just compare the absolute CCDR score for the dogs in the full dose group and the placebo, the dogs that got the placebo, this is just using a straight t-test, at 3 months, there is no statistical difference. The p-value there is 0.6, which is about as far from statistical significance as you're going to get. Okay, but again, that may not be the fairest way to do it because what we're really interested in is there a statistically significant difference in the change, the effect over time of the treatment? Interestingly, if we just look at the absolute scores, there was a statistically significant difference at 1 month, but in this case, the placebo dogs are actually performing better than the treated dogs. Okay, so if you want to make any claims, I guess you could make a claim that the dogs getting the placebo saw an improvement in cognitive function that was better than the dogs getting the full dose of the supplement, but I'm not going to make that claim. Okay, so now if we look at the change over time, because again, that's what we're really interested in. This shows you the average change from baseline in CCDR units at 1 month, 3 month, and 6 months. And so what you can see is that at 1 month, there was a pretty big decline in the dogs getting the placebo. It was bigger than the dogs getting the full dose treatment by quite a bit. But when we look at 3 months, that has sort of shifted. And the dogs that are getting the full dose showed this very large negative 4.1 CCDR score change compared to the placebo, which showed a change of negative 1.9. And the low dose in this case is negative 3. So you could almost argue that there might be a dose response effect here at 3 months. And then by 6 months, again, the placebo is doing the best compared to the other two groups. So this would be a little weird, but I guess it is formally possible that this supplement is transiently improving cognitive function over 3 months and then making it worse so that, again, there's no difference at 6 months. I don't think that's true. Even if that was true, I don't think I would want to give this to my dog, but that's about the best possible interpretation you can make here. Except if we do the statistical comparison, and again, this is just pairwise now, comparing placebo to either low dose or full dose at all 3 time points. And again, remember, this is the change. This is not the absolute values. This is the change. You can see at no point does the pairwise statistical comparison get anywhere close to statistical significance. And that's because there's a lot of spread in the data, right? Some animals showed an improvement, some animals got worse, some animals did nothing. So again, I think even if we really squinted and tried hard to see an effect here, the statistics just don't back it up. There's nothing here. And one odd thing that I noted, if you read the text carefully, the authors state, mild to moderate cognitive impairment is one of the entry criteria, meaning that dogs coming into the study had to show mild or moderate cognitive impairment. They didn't say what that meant, but that's one of the criteria. And then by exclusion, dogs with dementia, severe cognitive impairment, would be taken out of the study. They should not be enrolled in this study if they have dementia. So any dog with a score above 50 should not be participating in this study based on the author's own criteria. Surprisingly, when I looked in the supplemental data, there were 4 dogs that had scores above 50 at baseline, meaning dogs with dementia were enrolled into this trial. 2 in the high dose, 2 in the low dose group. None of those dogs were in the placebo group. And as it turns out, the inclusion of these dogs greatly skewed the 3-month results to favor the treatment groups. I don't know why that was the case, but that was the observation. And in particular, there was one dog that had a 29-point drop between baseline and 3 months that was not persistent. So again, to me, one possibility is that this supplement actually caused a huge improvement in cognitive function in this dog over the first 3 months, and then that went away between 3 months and 6 months. I think a far more likely interpretation is that there's a lot of noise in this CCDR test. And in fact, this goes back to the point I made earlier about using a test in a way that it has not been validated to be used. It seems very unlikely to me that this dog went from having dementia to having perfectly good cognitive function and back to having dementia in a 6-month period. Possible, but unlikely. Regardless, these dogs really should not have been included in the analysis, and they were, and I'm not really sure why they were. But if you take those dogs out, the apparent difference between groups at 3 months essentially goes away. It wasn't statistically significant to begin with, but it is essentially absent when you take those dogs out that were skewing the results in particularly the full dose group. So again, just another sort of weird thing about this study when you just dive into the details. So again, my view is even if you try really hard to see an effect here, the only potentially significant effect is the high dose group performed worse on the cognitive test at 1 month. That's the only thing that showed statistical significance in my view. And the supplement really never improved things. So if we go back to our criteria for what would this trial need to show, number 1, they have to show a validated measure of cognitive function. As far as I know, the CCDR test has never been validated for use in this way as a continuous tool. They have to show statistical significance. Again, I don't see any evidence for statistically significant benefits from the supplement. And they really should show that the supplement is in fact an NAD precursor and that it has senolytic activity. They don't actually say what the compounds are, so we can't evaluate that. And as far as I know, there's no evidence in dogs that this product has NAD boosting or senolytic activity in dogs. So I would say that this trial essentially failed in all 3 of the things that they would have needed to show in order to meet what they claim in the title and the abstract. In addition, I think this failure to disclose the composition of the experimental drug is pretty problematic. The inclusion of dogs that apparently did not meet the inclusion criteria and that those dogs were specifically in the 2 treatment arms is also concerning. And the fact that it at least has the appearance of cherry picking the endpoint at 3 months instead of 6 months when the trial actually ended. All of those together, again, really decreased the confidence that this study was interpreted in an unbiased way. So to sum up, I'm just not really sure that we can actually derive any real conclusions from this study, other than it seems like this particular supplement is relatively safe, at least over a 6-month time period. Clearly needs to be tested further in larger clinical trials before we'll be able to make any determinations about potential benefits in dogs. And so hopefully this has been helpful. Hopefully it's helped you to understand a little bit about why I am not enthusiastic about this particular product based on the data that's been presented so far, and also can give you some insights into what I think is a good way to approach the scientific literature. You need to have a fair degree of skepticism. That's true even if it's peer-reviewed, but in this case, particularly papers that have been submitted to preprint servers that really haven't undergone any quality control or peer review, you need to approach those with a very skeptical eye and not just believe what authors are trying to sell you. So hopefully that's been informative. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post them below. And I hope to see you next time on the Optispan Podcast.